Hi, everyone. My name's Karina. I'm a second-year CIPA student. I'm also a cyber RA with Professor Jason Healy. Before coming to CIPA, I worked at a public opinion research firm in DC focused on quantitative and qualitative research, specifically focused on mis and disinformation, which lends heavily to the research I've been doing here with Professor Healy. I've taken this time to expand and learn a little bit more about cyber, specifically in our Cyber Regulation lab on market failures. And I'm excited to introduce our moderator, Josephine Wolff, who is the Associate Professor of Cybersecurity Policy at Tufts University. I've had the pleasure of working with her. And then this is the panel on harmonization in cyber regulations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here to talk about cybersecurity regulatory harmonization, which I feel is usually a fairly niche topic and somehow has already been touched on 5 times today, which is the best way to come in. And I have with me just the best possible group of people to be discussing it with. So I'm going to introduce them each very briefly so that you mostly get to hear from them. To my right, we have Monica Ruiz Forscey, the Senior Cybersecurity Strategist at Microsoft. Next to her, Elizabeth Irwin, the Director of Strategic Risk at the Office of the National Cyber Director. Then on the end here in person, Emily Ferguson, who heads up the cyber portfolio for Senator Peters' office in the Senate. And then joining us online, I had hoped it would be the full size of this screen so that we could be staring at every pore in his face, but it's a really much more reasonable size. We have Professor Alexander Evans from the London School of Economics. And I'm going to start by asking each of you to say another sentence or two about your background if you'd like, but also to talk a little bit about sort of your very different perspectives on cybersecurity regulation harmonization, why you think it's important, and how we're doing at harmonizing these regulations, both within the United States and also thinking more internationally. So Monica, I'm going to start with you. And in particular, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your perspective sitting at Microsoft, why this is so important, right? What are the costs of not doing this or not getting this right?
Hello. Perfect. Hi. Well, thank you for that introduction, Josephine, and big thanks to colleagues at Columbia University for having me here. I think this is such an important topic to focus on, so I'm delighted to share a little bit about my perspective from industry, but specifically from Microsoft. Briefly, in terms of my background, I've been at Microsoft coming up on 4 years. I initially joined the company's digital diplomacy team, and as of May of this year, I moved over to the global cybersecurity policy team. And so this issue of regulatory harmonization is near and dear to us. In terms of your specific question, Josephine, I think it's important for me to provide a little bit of context in terms of how we're looking at it. So first, I think it's fair to say that there's been an increase in scale, speed, and sophistication of cyber incidents, and that has led to a lot of governments putting in place certain regulations that are focused on mitigating cyber risk and really beefing up cybersecurity resilience. That has also led to the potential of regulatory fragmentation, and we're already seeing some fragmentation in certain aspects of cybersecurity regulations. And so that's been a bit of a challenge from us from an industry perspective. And that, I think, is multiplied by the fact that there is no international forum where regulators can come together and talk about cybersecurity regulations, lessons learned, how to better align different measures that are being put in place. And so with that framing, I think 2 of the key goals that come to mind when we think about this issue of regulatory harmonization is, 1, to really urge governments to prioritize regulatory harmonization in the coming months, but B, to identify a forum where regulators can come together and talk about this issue, and ideally the OECD could be a potential forum for that. So now going more into your question about what are the challenges posed by regulatory fragmentation, but also some of the benefits of alignment. I'll start with benefits and then I'll go to the challenges. So in terms of benefits, I think I would put them in 3 different buckets. So the first one is benefits to national security. And so if there is better alignment, it could improve a government's ability to track, monitor, and compare cybersecurity incidents, which would be facilitated by shared definitions, timelines, and requirements that are ultimately better aligned. Secondly, I think about it through a cybersecurity talent lens. And so minimizing divergent regulations could certainly free up limited cybersecurity resources to focus more on that operational cyber defense piece that I know other speakers early on have talked about. And then thirdly, it also helps with resource allocation, right? Even from an industry perspective, we would be able to free up resources for investing in products, services, and even emerging tech that, again, focuses more on bolstering cyber defenses. That then brings me to some of the challenges posed by regulatory fragmentation, and I think some of them are informed by some of the benefits I just referenced to. And so fragmentation certainly impacts cybersecurity operations, as it could hinder effective defense operations and really shift a focus from cyber defense to compliance. Secondly, I once again look at it through a cybersecurity talent lens, right? So you have resources that you need, human resources that you need, that would essentially be diverted from that operational piece to the compliance piece. And then it overall creates added complexity as we think about how we can respond to certain requirements that are put in place. And I know it comes from a good place, but it certainly creates additional burdens from a regulated entity's perspective. And I know this is something Elizabeth will talk about following the RFI that ONCD put out, which I think does a really good job in terms of capturing that regulated entity perspective. And so ultimately, from an industry standpoint, I think this is a shared issue of priority, and we also share some of the challenges of fragmentation.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So Elizabeth, I want to come to you to talk a little bit about what you see as kind of the immediate next steps now that ONCD has gone through this RFI process, has synthesized all of the responses you got. What can we think about doing in the next 2 months, say? What seems like the low-hanging fruit here that we could really try to harmonize pretty soon?
Yeah. Is this on? Okay, good. Hi, Elizabeth Irwin, Director for Strategic Risk at ONCD. In terms of what we think of as immediate or near-term steps, a lot of it is, frankly, steady as she goes with the work that we've been doing with the Cybersecurity Forum for Independent and Executive Branch Regulators that is currently chaired by the Federal Communications Commission. And what that group does is it brings together approximately 30 members across the federal regulatory landscape. So financial services like the OCC, the Fed, the FDIC, EPA for the water sector, energy for the energy sector, and NERC and FERC, which you heard about earlier this morning, and a host of others. And what that group does, and is currently doing, and will continue to do, we hope, is bring together all of those regulators in a group where they can discuss these issues. And what we've been pushing, of course, at ONCD is this notion of regulatory harmonization. Because for critical infrastructure owners and operators, many of them are subject to multiple regulators, not only within their sector, but many times across other sectors. Telecommunications is a great example of this. And so they, as regulated entities, are encountering a lot of challenges in responding to this, as Moni alluded to, very fragmented landscape that has a lot of, at times, conflicting, if not duplicative, requirements for them. And that tremendously increases their compliance burden. And you heard in the first panel this morning the challenges that CISOs are encountering in allocating their resources to address that. So that's a long way of saying that that's an ongoing dialogue that we've been having with that group for at least the 2+ years that I've been at ONCD, and identifying with them through a voluntary lens what the regulators can do to work toward deconflicting that in an environment where, frankly, they have conflicting authorities, overlapping jurisdictions, a lot of competing equities, and don't have a ton of incentives to actually work together a lot of the time. And so our work with them has been focused up to this point on identifying things like shaping their best practices to help inform their regulated entities and improving their cybersecurity posture, looking at developing a model risk management framework for those entities, and particularly the under-resourced and the what we would call less mature ones. You've heard a lot. We are in New York City. We are in the global financial capital. And so I don't worry so much about financial services sector coming from that background, but I do worry about the less mature sectors that are out there that don't have these resources or haven't been thinking about cybersecurity as both a risk and a regulatory responsibility for a long time. The financial services sector has, and they are an outlier in that respect. But there are a lot of others on which you depend, water being the most obvious, but also chemical, critical manufacturing, where they're regulatory regime just has not been constructed for cybersecurity and is now in a place where we recognize that this is a national security and an economic security issue. And how do you adapt and modernize the regulatory regime to sufficiently address for that? Because that's fundamentally the role of regulation, right? It exists to drive safety and soundness and better outcomes. And so we're at an interesting point now where, and you heard earlier panelists talk about this is perhaps that one of the rare bright spots of bipartisanship, you could say, where there's an appetite to take the landscape that we have, but update it in a way that is more encompassing and more inclusive of the entire breadth of critical infrastructure to drive the better security outcomes that we're looking for.
Thank you. Emily, we heard a little bit about the Streamlining Federal Cybersecurity Regulations Act in the previous remarks. Word on the street is that you basically wrote it. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little about what you view as sort of the most critical pieces. And also, we've also heard a lot today about the idea that cybersecurity is a really bipartisan issue. I'm going to ask you to opine a little on how much enthusiasm there is for this in the Senate and Congress more broadly right now, and where you see that going.
Absolutely. I will not say that I was the only one writing it. There's a whole team that we've been working with, and it was really a collaborative, collective effort to get this bill to the form that it is today. And we've definitely appreciated all the stakeholder inputs that we received. We talked to a multitude of companies, federal agencies, different regulatory entities, not just here in the US, but around the world. We definitely talked a lot with OECD, relied pretty heavily on the RFI that y'all so lovingly put together and dealt with. It is beautiful work. So we're very thankful that this process has not been Senator Peters standing into the wind on this. There's been a collective effort. The bill itself, very importantly, is bipartisan. We've worked very closely with Senator Lankford and his team, and we also have other senators who are potentially interested in co-sponsoring, and there seems to be more and more interest on this issue, at least on the Senate side. We do know that it is also, there's discussions happening on the House side as well on this topic. The Committee on Oversight and Accountability in the House had a hearing in July on this issue, where they heard from industry members on this topic, and really there's gradually more and more education going on at the staff level. So we definitely see a path forward for this bill. We're seeing more and more enthusiasm. We have over 100 companies and groups that have publicly endorsed this bill as well. So we're very thankful to have this kind of groundswell of enthusiasm for actually tackling this idea. The idea behind the legislation is quite simple in that it's a common sense problem. You don't have the ability currently to build an action committee that is around harmonization. It's something that requires Congress to step in to actually force all regulated entities, including independent regulatory agencies, to come to the table to talk and harmonize their legislations. So what this bill does is it creates a harmonization committee at the Office of the National Cyber Director, which all regulatory agencies must be a part of. They must create a plan for harmonization, and then also, importantly, they must prove that this harmonization can be done through a pilot program. So you have this both top down and bottom up, in that you have the top of the agencies, the heads of these regulatory agencies, all sitting at the table together, looking at specific pieces of regulation for cybersecurity, saying, here's potential ways of harmonizing it, and then we're going to actually demonstrate that this can be done through a pilot program.
Thank you. Alexandra, I want to come to you now. We've heard a lot from the sort of US government perspective about what harmonization might look like here. I'm wondering if you can take us a little bit more global and talk about your perspective sitting in Europe for how much interest there is in other countries in trying to align regulations around cybersecurity, and also whether you see potential for the US as it's thinking about this effort to be trying to align itself more with some of the regulations we've seen come out of the EU or other places.
Sure, and first off, thanks very much for having me. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I have to be on a plane to the Middle East tomorrow. My background is as a British government official. let me see if we can get rid of this echo. Can you get rid of it, or are you still getting echo in the room?
It sounds pretty good to us.
It's good your end there, that's fine. I can live with an echo on my end. But I spent about 20 years in the British government working for successive Labour and Conservative administrations, including in 10 Downing Street for Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and as our cyber ambassador, our cyber director in the British government. But I'm obviously not speaking for the British government. Crucially, I've also spent time living in the US, working for the State Department, living in Brooklyn, and have a home in Traverse City, Michigan. And this is relevant. We know that the problem here is everything, everywhere, all at once. The attack surface has grown, and it's a Main Street, not just a Wall Street issue. This affects mom and pop businesses as much as big firms. And it's really material to economic growth, the competitiveness of the US, the UK, other like-minded democratic societies, as well as what we heard earlier, making sure that the regulatory burden and cost doesn't impinge on the investment that our societies really need. But look, I'm going to focus perhaps on two problems, particularly around one of which is global, and one of which is more sort of about the international relationships. The global is we have a problem. We have regulators, we have government officials, and we have industry. And they don't talk much to each other unless it's mediated by JDs. Yeah? So we have a lawyered up problem. But a lot of the formal exchanges are mediated over legislation or a regulatory issue, or they're two-way dialogues in this three-way, multi-way world. And I would argue that the nature of the challenge now, across sectors, across the economy, requires us to then think about having an approach that integrates, has more connectivity and more conversations between these different sectors. And those conversations aren't easy to have, particularly when you're talking about state-level regulators in the US, particularly when you're talking about regulators who guard their independence in Europe and in the UK. The second problem is, how do like-minded governments align, work together to boost economic growth, more resilience, more cybersecurity, and harden against threats, be they state threats or non-state threats, using the cyber dimension? And there's an opportunity here. The more we can do on this, we can release capital expenditure and reduce operational expenditure, the kind of compliance costs, the sort of non-performing costs that firms have, to boost growth in our respective economies. But so what? None of this is easy. We hosted at LSE a G7 meeting on this in September, trying to bring together governments, industry, and regulators, and we're doing a whole range of work around that. But there are some possible wins. Why is it not easy? Well, as any American knows, there's a difference in perspective if you sit in Texas or you sit in California. As any international policymaker knows, there's a difference in perspective if you are a US government of whatever flavour and the European Union or the UK. So achieving regulatory harmonisation is not always going to be easy. But ensuring that there's a conversation across borders on some of these issues is possible, it's necessary, and it's really important. And I think there are ways to do that, be it through the OECD, the G7, be it bilaterally, and it's really important we do it quickly, because actually a lot of the legislation and regulatory framework is changing, and it's changing fast. It's changing fast around AI, it's changing fast around new industrial policy and new cybersecurity policies. And so just having that conversation in the first instance is one, I would argue, quick win. But as we all know, bureaucrats talking around a table doesn't fix things necessarily. We also need to think about piloting actions that would actually show the dividend that we've talked about on the panel. And for me, some of that is around sharing best practices. It's finding alignment in areas where there isn't, where there aren't arguments to be nationally competitive or have very different regulatory approaches. And crucially, it's nerdy and boring, but so important. What can we do to make stuff like the form filling easier? If you like, how do we fix the DMV problem of cybersecurity regulatory compliance? And that is an area where obviously there's a national agenda on that, but where there can be an international one as well. It's not going to be straightforward. I think the new incoming administration, will have just as many incentives to do this as the current administration in the US. And for all governments in Europe, it's also a key priority. So back over to you.
Thank you so much. So I have some questions. I'm in the grand tradition of professors going to try and probably fail to save some time for all of you to ask questions. So start thinking about those now. I want to start by asking for your most specific example of not harmonized regulations. I feel we sometimes talk about regulatory harmonization at this very high level. There are rules for all these different sectors. If you were gonna make the kind of 60-second pitch, can you believe for this regulation we have to do multi-factor authentication this way, and for this regulation a whole other contradictory set of rules? Monica, I'm gonna come to you first. Do you have kind of an example that really sticks out to you of this is a crazy way to be regulating cybersecurity?
No, I appreciate the question, Josephine, and I think you just made reference to a type of security control like multi-factor authentication. Of course, you have other considerations around vulnerability reporting, but the one that really comes to mind when you ask this question is cyber incident reporting. And of course, this is not a new topic to a lot of folks in this room, and it's clear that there are some inconsistencies on this particular issue, whether it's which businesses need to report, when to report, to what government agency to report, when to make it public, not only to customers, but more broadly. And that becomes even more complicated when you look at different timelines. Even in a US context alone, there are variations of when a regulated entity is supposed to report something, right? Under SHRCIA, we know it's 72 hours. I know the TSA directive for rail security, public transportation, and pipelines is 24 hours. And then the SEC disclosure rule is 4 business days. And this becomes even more complex when you look at it internationally. I know in Japan you have to report immediately. In India you have 6 hours. In Australia you have 12 to 72 hours. In the European Union I think you have, 24 to 72. And I think South Korea recently updated its Network Act to require a 24 to 72 hour reporting timeline as well. And so as you can imagine, this certainly ranks top of the list as I was thinking about, well, what are those examples that certainly resonates with many in this room that I think is worth highlighting? I would also be remiss if I didn't mention some of the benefits with aligning on this particular issue of cyber incident reporting. So it would certainly create a more consistent way of capturing data points to effectively share information. It would improve threat intelligence sharing. It would improve vulnerability management. It could inform the adjustment of security controls, as we mentioned, multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, depending on what the incident was. And it would ultimately expedite incident response. And so this, once again, is an example of why we need better alignment and the benefits associated with better harmonization and the potential of reciprocity agreements across different regulations, in this case being cyber incident reporting.
Got it. Other thoughts, other specific examples that stand out to anyone?
Well, Monica took the easy answer. The low-hanging fruit one, yeah. There's many, but it is the one everyone loves to complain about at length. And you'll notice that if Emily alluded to our request for information, if you notice that we at OECD explicitly scoped out incident reporting for a host of reasons, one of them legal, but also because, not to dismiss it, we're very cognizant of the challenges inherent in that. And I probably field 8 complaints a day just from members that respond to the FIBIC community about this issue. And discrepancy is, even just within that one particular sector on incident reporting. But how we view that is more of a reactive type of regulation, and we are more focused on a proactive stance, right? Incident reporting can deliver very important information. We don't dispute that at all, and there are valid reasons for it. But our effort here at ONCD for regulatory harmonization is more proactive in that we're looking to a long-term strategic enhancement of cybersecurity posture. You know, the left to boom, as people like to say, what happens before an incident, or ideally preventing an incident. So for us, you know, I can't point to one specific one, though our RFI responses had a lot of interesting examples, especially in the healthcare sector. But I would say that we are looking at things like, you alluded to controls, MFA being, I think, one that a lot of people understand. That is implemented inconsistently across critical infrastructure sectors. In some cases, it's very heavily mandated, and in others, it's, you know, voluntary, strongly encouraged. And that is, of course, I think we've learned problematic. And though we may, as professionals, understand that that is a best practice, if your regulatory regime is such that it's just voluntary or strongly encouraged, it's a guideline but not a rule approach to implementation, there are going to be uneven implementation and regulatory and supervisory challenges inherent in that. And so, as I alluded to earlier, that's some of the work that we're doing with the Cyber Regulators Forum, is to identify those opportunities for streamlining things like controls across critical infrastructure sectors, still accounting for what we like to call bespoke or sector-specific risk as appropriate, but there are, we think, opportunities to introduce that minimum or baseline cybersecurity requirement, and that would involve looking at these things where regulators, well-intended, have written guidance that may be contradictory to a regulated entity that's responding to multiple regulators.
Yeah, building on the conversation about cyber incident reporting, when we wrote and passed CIRCIA, Cyber Incident Reporting and Critical Infrastructure Act, we definitely saw that this could potentially become an issue. So we specifically said that at DHS, there needs to be the Cyber Incident Reporting Council, which shall be the lead for harmonizing all cyber incident reporting requirements amongst executive branch agencies. And with the report that the CIRC put out last year, looking at 53 different cyber incident regulations, we definitely saw that that was a huge task ahead of them, ahead of the CIRC. So we're closely following the efforts of that entity that we did set up under CIRCIA. I feel like cyber incident reporting definitely makes a good example of both the negatives of disharmonization and then the potential benefits that come from harmonization. The benefits are, under CIRCIA, if you report once, you can then have that reciprocity across multiple regulators, which we built into the legislation. And then on the downsides, the disharmonization that we're seeing, the multiple different triggering for incidents, different timelines, different information. I just feel like it makes a good example.
So there's nobody on this panel and probably nobody in this room who's opposed to harmonization. It just sounds good, right? I do think there's a fear here that some people have, which is around sort of if we harmonize below the level of cybersecurity we want, and you brought up sort of this baseline requirements idea that different sectors can build on top of, which I think makes a lot of sense. But one of the things I was very struck by reading through the responses to that RFI, and I'm going to hazard a guess that on this stage and in this room in general, there are more people who have read more of those responses than possibly anywhere else in the country, is a lot of the respondents said, well, what if we harmonized around the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? Like that would be so great. We all use that already. It's perfect. My reaction to that is, well, of course you love that. The NIST cybersecurity framework is anything you want it to be, right? And so I think there's a little bit of a risk around thinking of harmonization as a way to actually lower the level of cybersecurity, even if it is framed in that sort of, we're going to have baseline requirements that people can build on top of. And I'm curious, I'm going to come to you first, Elizabeth, to talk a little about this. When you're thinking about harmonization, how do you strike that balance between we don't want it to be so specific that it only applies to pipelines, but we also don't want it to be so loose that it's really sort of open to interpretation and actually brings us back down to the point where we were that led all of these sectors to start making their own regulations?
Yeah, that's a great question, Josephine. I mean, the short answer is what our intent, our hope, our dream, our wish is to create a floor, not a ceiling. right? And the reality is that some sectors do have a floor and others, there is no floor. There's not a basement, there's not a cellar, there's nothing. And so our goal is to create a floor for them, which is, this is what everyone needs to hit to achieve that minimum level of cybersecurity posture. You can go above and beyond that. And trust and believe, some regulators are going to go above and beyond that. They already do, right? For them, some there may be no ceiling. Anything is possible. And that is our goal, is to at least get the floor in there so that we can sleep a little more soundly at night. And again, accommodating that there are sectors, each sector has own specific risk profiles, right? We've heard a lot of talk about the grid earlier today, right? Safety and security of the grid, there are certain critical processes and operations that are very specific to that type of a facility that are different from what we would label critical processes and operations for a financial institution or for a telecommunications provider. And that's where our argument is that you, as the regulator or regulators for that specific sector, with your expertise, having regulated for a long time and understanding the risk profile of the regulated entities in that sector, understanding what the threats are, that you would come in and then build the other layers, if you will, in this metaphor, of that house. You can go up and create that ceiling. But the challenge that we're seeing here, and you've heard a lot of talk about even ransomware, and ransomware exploits this reality, which is that there is no floor, right? And so that's what our philosophy, our approach to the problem, at least at ONCD, is creating that. And then, to your point, allowing the regulators to come in, of course, with their authorities and create whatever they feel comfortable with going above and beyond that as is appropriate and necessary to their specific sector. Because it's been our observation, and even in our conversations with the regulators, they have come around to this view in a lot of ways too, which is, to your point, just saying NIST, which is voluntary and a best practice, to be clear, that's wide open to interpretation. And some people may take a very liberal, loosey-goosey view of it. And as a regulator, that may not be exactly what you want. And so creating a regime that puts in a minimum that everyone, as we like to say, that's table stakes. You have to be at this to begin with. And then building in that bespoke requirement above and beyond that, that would speak to those more tailored situations.
So I guess my question is, how concrete should that floor be? And this is a question not just for Elizabeth. Is that floor multi-factor authentication for all remote access and encryption with certain kinds of encryption algorithms for all data at rest? Or is that floor like do a threat model and put in place some authentication controls? That's the balance that I'm interested to hear what each of you thinks in terms of trying to define how concrete is that floor?
I will say, from a congressional perspective, it's often difficult to craft legislation for a floor, especially when you have so many sectors needing different levels of security from the start. But when there are those points of overlap, when you have multiple regulators overseeing the same group, at least getting those multiple regulators to talk to each other and having an alignment for that one sector where they all oversee, that's at least going to be a significant relief, even if you don't immediately build a floor.
Alexander, for my days in hybrid teaching, I know I'm inclined to neglect the people online. So I want to come to you for a moment to talk a little about both sort of this idea of a floor and what it might look like, and also whether you think something like the OECD could be a useful institution for trying to spread this a little bit more globally.
Well, look, I mean, I think the trick here is how do you have a floor that's robust but low cost? And there is an opportunity here. If you're building newer forms of regulatory frameworks, as I said, you can either look at a single sector and some degree of integration. You can also look at kind of like what would that common minimum building standard, if you like, be across the economy. I'm a big fan of aligning incentives for individuals. So I like the idea, for example, of why not put a duty on boards to have a nominated board member responsible for cyber and for cyber risk. So almost like the CFO carries the finance risk in most boards. Obviously, but whoever heads up the finance and risk committee, for example, in a board, why not impose that as a minimum requirement for companies above a certain size? You don't want to squeeze tiny startups, but there is something important here about getting people to take it seriously. In terms of other countries doing this stuff as well. I'm not going to claim that Europe or the UK are great examples. We in the UK have tended to have a risk-based approach and a principles-based approach to regulation. The European Union is much more rules-based. Part of the challenge here is how do we avoid having a framework where there's lots of regulatory and compliance activity which isn't actually deepening and building cybersecurity, is just adding cost, and makes us more vulnerable in terms of economic competition, in particular with companies in Asia that are going to be wanting to eat our lunch and our breakfast and our supper too. So the one element on this I do think is important. This may sound strange coming from somebody. I've spent most of my career in apex policymaking, working at the centre of government. But I think there's an East Wing, West Wing problem on lots of this stuff. A lot of regulation is about East Wing. It's not the West Wing. It's not exciting stuff about who's in, who's out, who's in the White House, who's on the Hill. It's actually about that nitty-gritty OMB world of how do you actually implement rules, what are you going to design, what's happening in individual regulators. And this is strategically so important, but we need a bit of appetite from the White House, as we see, from the Hill to get interested in how do you do the East Wing piece of this as well as the West Wing piece of it. One nerdy suggestion, which is what can we do around just simplifying forms? It sounds really boring and base, but if we actually have form design that identifies similar fields for different regulators, you can still have varying regulatory requirements across regulators or across sectors, but at the very least, for firms trying to pay to comply with that, there is a simpler framework to fulfill that compliance, but also boost security.
Just wanted to add one comment based on your question and something Emily alluded to. I think your question and seeking specific examples of baseline requirements and our sort of answers around not providing specific recommendations, but rather reinforcing the fact that there needs to be a forum for regulators to talk about this, right? Like that will help us better understand and inform what are those potential baseline requirements that are tied to incentives, as Alexander said, but also informed by lessons learned and actual insights that could inform that approach. And so just to foot stomp the fact that we need an international forum where regulators can come together and talk about these issues.
Terrific. All right, do we have some microphones for folks in the audience? Go ahead, we're gonna take a couple questions before we answer them, and that way we can pick our favorite ones. No, that way we can get more of your questions in. So I see we have one there in the back. We have a microphone coming to you, right on the other side. There you go.
Yes, thank you very much. So I did a brief stop in my career in the cyber insurance industry, and one of the discussions going on now is in underwriting, asking questions that both deal with the individual risk of a company, but could also affect accumulation risk across a book. And a good example of this is, do you have a multi-factor authentication for all your user accounts, individual company? And then if you're making software, do you apply secure by design principles for that software? That would be a third-party accumulative risk, right? That might affect other people in the supply chain or your whole book of business. As you're doing regulatory harmonization, are you guys also looking at controls that would be best practices for the company, but also potentially more accumulative risk control questions?
Terrific. We're going to take a couple more questions before we start answering. I see one over there.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for this insightful panel. My name is Amit Lazari. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Open Policy, and we do use AI in the area of cyber policy and democratize access to policy to unicorns and startups. We've been tracking, of course, and working with policymakers on this topic. Very honored to be testifying once they're CEO on the Hill and working, of course, with the Senate on the bill. And I wanted to touch on the topic of using technology
and specifically innovative technology to find how common controls are being addressed runtime. A lot of the conversation that we've seen about regulatory duplicity talked about, looking for, mutual language, mutual controls, conversations between regulators, but we find that actually it's technology solutions that are really gathering a lot of the compliance artifacts and are being used in other areas to streamline, if you think about things like OSCAL, right, in the area of FedRAMP. So would love your views on how technology solutions, especially ones that are focusing on governance and compliance, can be helpful to address this problem of either harmonization or finding areas for reciprocity.
Thank you. Let's come up front here.
Hi, thanks. Manish Walter-Puri, thank you for a robust discussion about something that can be pretty tedious. Which other areas of regulation did you look at or do you think about when you think about harmonization? I'm thinking like the Basel Accords or International Civil Aviation or even the FDA, European Medicine Association. Where have you seen lessons or where are you trying to draw from or what's your model? We want to be like that in 5 years or 10 years. Thank you.
And right behind you.
TJ Pizek with Capstone. So elephant in the room, changing Congress. How does that shift how you're thinking about getting this bill over the line and timeline, who you're bringing in, that sort of thing?
Fantastic. Let's take one more. Right up here.
John Carlson, American Bankers Association. I'm really happy to hear you guys read our comment letter from the FISIC in terms of concerns about harmonization and in particular incident notification. Another big pain point, which I hope I hear more about, is about third-party risk management and what role harmonization can play in terms of addressing that, as well as I think in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, there was a big emphasis on changing the oversight of cloud service providers, which more and more folks in the industry are using. And so how do we get better visibility in terms of some of the risks, as well as the capabilities that the cloud service providers have?
All right, I think I'm going to let people answer some of these. Just to refresh your memories, we've got a cumulative risk, we've got a question about technology solutions, questions about sort of analogies or comparative processes in other industries, what's going to happen in Congress, looking at you, Emily, and also thinking about third-party risk and how that fits into this larger framework. And rather than call on you to answer specific questions, I'm going to let you pick your favorite. And Emily, since I've already called on you to answer a specific question, I'm going to start with you.
That's fine. Yes, obviously changing Congress is going to happen in January. It's going to be a big change. I personally work for Senator Peters, who right now is the chair of Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. We will change to the minority. But that doesn't mean that our work on cybersecurity will stop. In fact, we think that this is a strongly, strongly bipartisan issue, and that interest in it and demand for this kind of congressional solution actually will just continue to grow. Our bill has strong bipartisan support, and we're definitely working to get it across the finish line this Congress. I think there's definitely a chance. And I will be working personally very, very hard over the next few weeks to make sure that that happens so that we can end this Congress with a much needed win. But I am looking forward to next Congress. It's going to be a very different kind of conversation. But it also, there's going to be new players in Congress. There's new senators, new members of the House of Representatives. And whenever you have a turnover like that, it brings in new ideas, new staff members, new perspectives. And that's always welcome, especially since technology is always evolving. So hope that answers your question. Let me know if it doesn't.
Elizabeth, how about you? What question struck you most?
I'll go ahead and take the third-party / supply chain circus question, because this came up a lot. In our RFI responses, the two most common words were compliance burden. I'd say the third and fourth most common words, or however many it's going to be, were supply chain risk management, et cetera. Stating the obvious, of course, the United States does not currently have what we would call a super regulator for the cloud. Whether that changes in the near term or the far term remains to be seen. But in the absence of that, we have seen regulators for critical infrastructure try to tackle this problem in fits and starts. So I'll come back to financial services. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but in financial services sector, for example, absent anything else, what is often used to, shall we say, get at cloud service providers is a regulator reaches through the financial institution, typically leveraging an authority like the Bank Service Company Act, to go and touch the third party. In this case, AWS or Azure or whomever, because they provide the backbone that's moving all this money around the world. If you are a regulated entity, I imagine you have views on that experience and what that's like. If you are the regulator themselves, they too have views, and they have told us, they realize this is an imperfect solution to what is a problem and a legitimate risk area and concern for them. So absent changes in authorities, perhaps, that more specifically get at that or grant new authorities to regulators for the cloud service provider area specifically, I think this is what's going to continue, at least in the near term. And so our approach at ONCD, recognizing that that is imperfect and the challenge is inherent in that, is there a way to do that more sensibly? And also, again, I use that as an example, but if you are a regulator in other sectors, you don't even have that type of reach through. And so a lot of this, you end up looking at it through contract language. That's another solution that tries to get at the cloud service provider risk. That also rough around the edges in many cases for both sides, both parties. And all of these are kind of like been bolted on over time as regulators have come to the realization that they need to start looking at CSPs given how much they underpin critical infrastructure. And so for us, how we are talking about this with the regulators is there a way to do this, recognizing the limitations of your current authorities and frankly, practicality of it, but in a way that's a little more sensible? And our effort at ONCD is explicitly focused on that enterprise common ICT, right? We're not looking at SCADA systems, for example, for a host of reasons, not the least of which is they're very sector specific. But we recognize that things like CSPs are not just being run over at Bank of America, they're also being run at Southern Company, which is an electricity provider. They're also being run at AT&T. And given all the interconnections between that, surely there has to be some way to go about looking at this and implementing minimum requirements that accounts for that. So that's a long way of saying we recognize that it's a challenge, and we're not trying to ignore what may be that elephant in the room, but working at least with the tools we have so far with the regulators and other stakeholders to think about how you could approach that, shall we say, more fairly distributes the burden, not so it's solely on the regulated entity, which is the primary line of defense in this metaphor, but also where do the CSPs themselves, where will they have requirements, or what role, what's the responsibility allocation between the regulated entity and other parts of its supply chain, CSPs being the most obvious part of that. But there are, cybersecurity products and services, those vendors. We've received a lot of questions and a lot of comments in our interactions with industry stakeholders about what are you doing about the risk I'm inheriting, upstream or downstream as the case may be, from other entities in my supply chain.
Thank you. Monica.
I'm happy to take the question from the gentleman in the back who asked about certain measures companies are taking around security. You mentioned security by default. And last year, Microsoft launched something called Secure Future Initiative that looks at this very issue. It's divided up into 3 different pillars, so security by default, security by design, and secure operations. And this is in response to what I alluded to at the outset, which is an increasing ecosystem of cyber threats, both scale, speed, sophistication, and beyond. And so as a company, we have taken this rise in threats very, very seriously, and have put the Secure Future Initiative in place, and it actually entails putting roughly 34,000 engineers to focus on this very issue and map out what we can do as a company across these 3 different pillars, in part because we acknowledge that this is something that is a top priority across the board, especially for a company like ours. But we welcome partnership, we welcome support. This is certainly something industry can do and play a proactive role in terms of secure by default, but we also see that there is a role for other stakeholders in mitigating cyber risk, and so welcome that.
So Alexander, you're left with a choice between technology solutions and thinking about sort of harmonization in other areas, and whether we have some models, either positive or negative, that we should be looking at as we think about this process.
Sure, thank you. Well, look, first off, obviously, we should be treating systemic risk slightly differently to regular risk, but remembering regular risk is everywhere. So to pick up on Elizabeth's floors analogy, let's go up some floors and make sure our lifts are working for systemic risk. On tech solutions, yeah, up to a point, right? I'm not sure there's a silver bullet, either an AI one or otherwise, but tech solutions can help. And we saw that around sanctions compliance, for example, where a range of companies and aggregator services offered tech solutions that didn't fix the problem of compliance, but certainly helped with that compliance offering. On the analogous piece, I think this is really important. I think there's lots of cross-learning to be done from aviation, as you say. Look at the way in which there has been regulatory mutual recognition and degrees of harmonization around advanced passenger information, for example, or in aviation. Around counterterrorism, look at the degree of harmonization and mutual recognition standard setting driven after 9/11 around the world, particularly under US leadership, looking at things like how do you harmonize for sharing of data around exit lists of citizens leaving countries and traveling, particularly when the foreign terrorist fighter problem became such an issue. And we also have, obviously, models from financial services. And I'm very interested that Basel was mentioned by the questioner in the back, because it's worth thinking here also about innovation. 25 years ago, I was at a meeting of most of the major banks in London. We had to have regulators present because otherwise this would have been a cartel moment, where there was a discussion, an active discussion amongst a range of CEOs, principally actually in the insurance sector, about whether there could be an insurance alternative to capital adequacy and Basel II and Basel III, as it were. So I would also encourage us to think outside the box on some of this stuff. That's not to say it's not fixing regulation, but getting regulation to be better, even if it's not going to be best, is important. But also being really properly innovative. I think there's a huge opportunity here, and it's an opportunity that will bear dividends for Americans and for Brits and for Europeans and for other citizens in like-minded countries.
Thank you. Well, I'm very struck by all four of you and sort of the consensus that it sounds like emerges around there's huge opportunity, particularly in incident reporting, making the form simpler, which seems to be near and dear to Alexander's heart, getting the timelines more aligned so that you know if you have 6 hours or you have 12 hours or you have 72 hours or you have 4 weeks. And I think creating the forum for people to have the harder conversations around, well, what about the technical controls? Which solutions do we think really matter and should be at that baseline? And also trying to strike that balance between what's a baseline that we can sort of apply pretty broadly, and how do we then begin to build on that and account for the ways in which different sectors, different types of networks and computer systems and data may require different types of security. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and